Hey friends, this is the Miss Wolfie from our Half Acre Homestead, and I'm starting the next wedding quilt. Okay, let's start with the mouse trap, okay? Because this fabric, your alternating or contrasting fabric for your mouse trap is going to have to be cut into 3.5-inch strips, okay? 3.5-inch strips. You might get confused with, because there's going to be 2.5-inch strips in here, but they're 3.5 inches wide. So cut all your contrasting fabric into strips. I've cut mine a little tiny bit differently, but only because there's writing on here. So I've cut my strips, or a good portion of them right now, into 3.5-inch strips. And now I'm going to cut some of the shorter ones. So let's just going to even off my end here. And I'm going to go up now to 2.5 inches. So that's all you need to remember for the cutting of your contrast block, okay? Because I'm using a different fabric, it made me think about how to do it. But even if you're using white, you're still going to need strips of 3.5 inch. But then you can cut them into 2.5 inches. And I don't think I have enough left on this piece. No, I don't. Okay, so now we want 8.5-inch strips. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refold this. Folks, when you're cutting strips, this is one of the reasons why people like to use jelly rolls, because when you're cutting strips, it's very, very easy to have your fabric not straight and then your lines aren't straight. So the best way for me to solve that is, to solve it if there's a problem. But you can fold it if it's really nicely folded. So we're going to line up the outside edge with the ruler, and we're going to trim off. There's always a piece on the end that's not quite straight. So now we're going to turn our ruler over. I'm going to measure it to 8.5 inches at my mat, and then cut it along the baseline. Or you can pull it up, flip your ruler lengthwise until your 8.5 mark is here. That's 8.5. And then cut off at the bottom of the ruler. All right, when I have these cut up, I will proceed on with the mouse block. And now that I have my 3.5-inch pieces cut for the mouse trap block, I'm just going to even this off, and I'm going to cut myself 4 2.5-inch squares. Remember, folks, measure twice, cut once. All right, now we have 4 2.5 by 2.5 pink blocks. We have enough 2.5 by 3.5 of the alternate fabric, and enough in the 8.5 by 3.5. So let's make our corresponding blocks for our pink ones. Make sure that the seam allowance you use for your very first block is the seam allowance you use throughout your entire quilt. Again, measure twice, cut once, and line up and pin if you're not good at freehand sewing, okay? I always use the edge of my presser foot to the edge of my fabric. And what that does is that gives us roughly a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I'm doing this, I keep my iron going, and for the sake of nice crisp corners, I iron every piece as I go along. You folks have heard me say it before, and I will say it again. If you don't like ironing, don't get into quilting. All right, so now I'm going to take, I've got my 3.5 inch piece and my 2.5 inch piece of pink. And now I'm going to take another 3.5 inch piece, because this is going to be our center. This is the mouse. All right, again over here, and iron it out. There's our mouse. Now let's build the trap. And the trap's really easy, folks. It's this. You take your 8.5 inch strip and you pin it at each end. Make sure your corners are all nice and sharp. You pin it at each end. You always start at the end first, because sometimes your inside, this is a solid piece of fabric, and this is made up of pieces, so this will have a tendency to stretch more. So pin on the outside and then line up your center and pin down at the seams of your mouse block or your mouse fabric. Just like that. All right, so I'm going to run it through the sewing machine here. Again, always using the same seam allowance that you chose with your very first block. All right. This is why showing quilt blocks is so difficult. It's really hard to get a good angle. And again, I love these little tabletop ironing boards because they're so handy. And I built myself a nice little quilter's corner here. Okay, and now we do our last piece, right sides of work facing, pin on the outside each, line up where your mouse is, and pin it at the seam of the mouse so that it just keeps everything nice and tight. I learn more with every quilt I do. And so. Alrighty. Pins out. I'm making this block is 8.5 inches by 8.5 inches. Okay, so I will be using 11 blocks by 11 blocks. Okay, because my batting that I bought is 96 by 108. I'm still going to have to trim and block. But this is the easiest one. So for a queen size quilt, you are going to need 62 of these blocks in the colors of your choosing. Now remember, make sure you have enough of your dramatic fabric to make the same number of Puss in the Corner blocks. Okay? We'll be back when it's time to do the Puss in the Corner block. All right? Take care. God bless.